The morning I invited Margaret Holloway to coffee, I had no agenda, no plan, and absolutely no idea I was about to light a slow fuse under the quietest life I had ever built for myself. Margaret lived 4 houses down in the gray Cape Cod with the overgrown rose bushes and a front porch that sagged on the left side. She had been divorced for about 2 years. I knew this the way you know things about neighbors you have never properly met. From a distance, from small talk at mailboxes, from the way the second car disappeared from her driveway one January and never came back. The way a house changes sound when one of the people in it stops coming home. You notice. You don't say anything because saying something would require you to have a relationship strong enough to hold the weight of it. And most neighbor relationships are not built for weight. I am not a man who inserts himself into other people's situations. I want to be clear about that from the start. My name is Daniel Carr. I was 41, a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Columbus, and I had lived on Wentworth Lane for going on 6 years. I owned my house, I maintained my lawn, I waved to people I recognized and nodded at people I didn't. I returned borrowed tools. I took my trash cans in on the same day everyone else did. I was, by every reasonable measure, a decent neighbor and an invisible one. My wife, Claire, had left 3 years before Margaret's husband did. Different circumstances, same result. The second bedroom in my house still had her reading chair in it because I had never quite decided what to do with the space, and doing nothing felt less permanent than choosing. The chair was comfortable. Sometimes I sat in it. I told myself that wasn't a symptom of anything. I was not bitter. I want to say that plainly because what comes next might make it sound otherwise. I had worked through the end of my marriage the same way I worked through most things. Slowly, carefully, with a level in my hand and a list of small tasks to complete. I fixed the back fence that Claire had been asking me to fix for 2 years, and which I had gotten around to approximately 2 weeks after she stopped being there to ask. I repainted the kitchen the color she had always hated. I took up running, and then gave up running, and then took up woodworking instead, which turned out to suit me better because it required patience and produced something you could hold. I was functional. I was fine. I was also, somewhere underneath all of it, profoundly lonely in the quiet way that only settles in after you stop expecting it to be different. The kind of lonely that doesn't announce itself. That just sits in the room with you after dinner, not making any noise. The coffee idea started the way a lot of things I regret starting usually do. It was something small and decent that felt obvious at the time. It was a Saturday in early October, the kind of morning where the air had turned cool enough to notice, but the sun was still doing its job. I had been out front checking the side gate when I saw Margaret at her window with a shutter that wasn't cooperating. Not dramatically, not crying or anything like that, just wrestling with something stuck and going nowhere. The particular frustrated stillness of a person who has been dealing with things alone long enough that even the stuck shutter feels personal. I walked over. I hadn't planned to. I just did. The latch had corroded. 5 minutes with a screwdriver from my truck, and it moved fine. She thanked me twice and looked embarrassed both times, the way people do when they've been managing alone long enough that accepting help feels like admitting something they didn't mean to admit. Before I walked back to my place, I said something without thinking about it. The words came out before I had finished deciding to say them. If you ever want coffee sometime, I'm usually home Saturday mornings. No pressure, just an open offer. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Surprised, maybe, a little careful. Then she said, "That would be nice, actually." And that was that. We had coffee the following Saturday at the small place on Elmwood with the mismatched chairs and the handwritten specials board. It lasted 2 hours, which was longer than I planned for and exactly as long as it needed to be. Margaret was a high school librarian, sharp and dry, and 10 times funnier than her quiet front porch suggested. She talked about her divorce without making it dramatic, the way people do when they've already cried the big cries and arrived somewhere past them. She talked about her kids, 2 teenage girls who split their time between her house and their father's new apartment 2 towns over. She talked about the rose bushes, which had been her mother's project originally, planted the summer her mother visited for 2 weeks and stayed for 6, and which Margaret was now solely responsible for maintaining and quietly terrified of failing. I talked more than I had talked in months. About the woodworking projects stacking up in my garage. About the job, which was good, but technically exhausting in a way that didn't leave a lot of residue at the end of the day, except fatigue. About the chair in my second bedroom that I hadn't moved, and the way I had painted the kitchen a color I had chosen by process of elimination. She didn't comment on that last part. She just looked at me with the brief, steady attention of someone who had heard the real meaning under the words and chosen to let me carry it at whatever pace I needed. Walking back to my car afterward, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Not romantic, not anything I could even name precisely. Just the clean, simple feeling of having been seen by another person who understood what a quiet Saturday morning actually costs you when you've been spending them alone. That was where it should have ended. One coffee, a pleasant morning, a neighbor I could wave to with a little more warmth than before. But on the drive home, I passed Karen Delacroix walking her dog near the corner of Wentworth and Birch. Karen lived 2 streets over technically, but her youngest daughter went to school with Margaret's girls, and she ended up near Wentworth most mornings on that walk. I had spoken to her maybe a dozen times over the years. I knew she was divorced, that her ex-husband had moved to Denver 18 months ago, and that she had been working double shifts at the hospital ever since because the Denver situation had rearranged the financial reality she had spent 17 years planning for. She had the look that people get when they've been putting one foot in front of the other for so long that the putting of feet has become the whole personality. Not unhappy exactly, just occupied, moving through something that didn't have a far side yet. I thought about how long it had been since someone probably just sat down across from Karen Delacroix and asked how she was doing without needing something from her in return. Without it being about the schedule or the logistics or the medical thing she could advise on or the form that needed explaining. Just asked how she was doing and then waited. I waved. She waved back. And I drove home with the beginning of what I told myself was simply a neighborly impulse and nothing more complicated than that. By the following month, I had taken 3 women out for coffee. Margaret first, as I said, then Karen, who laughed more than I expected and cried twice briefly and both times apologized for it. And both times I told her she didn't need to, which seemed to surprise her each time like the information hadn't fully landed the first go-round. Then Judith Brennan from the pale yellow split level at the end of the cul-de-sac. Judith had been divorced for 5 years, had a son in his second year of college, and worked from home doing medical transcription. She had a calm precision to her that made her seem contained until she wasn't, and then she was very not. She told me once, leaning over her coffee mug with both hands wrapped around it like it was the warmest thing in the room, that the hardest part of her week was Thursday evenings. Because that was when she and her ex-husband used to watch the same 2 shows every single week without fail. For 14 years. She did not say it to be sad. She said it the way you report a weather pattern you've accepted. Here is a thing that is still true. Here is how it goes. I told her I had a chair I couldn't move and a kitchen color I chose by elimination. She looked at me and said, "We're both a little haunted, aren't we?" It wasn't a question. The conversations were never about dating. I want to make that clear because I know how this sounds, and I know what people assume when they hear a single man on a street full of divorced women scheduling Saturday mornings with them one by one. I have heard the assumptions since then, and I understand why they exist. But that is not what this was. There was no agenda. There was no strategy. There was no version of me working my way through a list, checking boxes, hoping one of these women would become something more than what she was. What it was, honestly, was simpler and stranger than that. And stranger was the part one didn't understand yet. I had discovered, almost by accident, that I was good at something I hadn't known was a skill. Sitting across from someone who had been managing alone and making them feel like the managing was worth noticing. Asking the question and then actually listening to the answer and then asking the next question that came from genuinely caring about the answer to the first one. I don't know where that came from. Maybe from 3 years of living quietly and having too much room in my own head to think about what other people were carrying. Maybe from watching Claire leave and understanding, after the fact, that I had been a man who was easier to leave than to tell things to. Whatever the source, it turned out to be something people needed. More than I expected, more than I had thought to plan for. By December, word had apparently gotten around. Wentworth Lane is 12 houses, most of them occupied by people who had lived there long enough to know the difference between someone's regular car and new one. News travels the way it always does in places like that. Not through announcement, not through gossip exactly, through the accumulated weight of small observations, through things said at school pickups and mentioned at the holiday gathering at the Hendersons' house and relayed sideways through the particular information network that exists on every block where people have been neighbors long enough to know each other's business without ever quite discussing it directly. Nora Tillman knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening in December with a jar of homemade orange marmalade and a look on her face that told me the marmalade was not really about marmalade. She was 44, recently divorced after a 17-year marriage to a man who had, apparently, been becoming a different person slowly for years before she had noticed the person he was becoming was one she wouldn't have chosen. She lived directly across the street. I could see her kitchen light from my front window most evenings. She handed over the jar and stood on my porch looking at me with a directness I respected even before I knew what she was going to say with it. "Margaret mentioned you two had coffee." I looked at the jar. I said we did. She looked at the porch floor for just a second, then back up at me. "Is that an open invitation, or was it specific to her?" I told her it was open. "We had coffee that Thursday." She arrived 10 minutes early and looked mildly embarrassed about it, which was the first and last time I saw Nora Tillman look embarrassed about anything. By February, I had sat across a coffee table or a cafe counter or, twice, a park bench with 6 women from within a 4-block radius. Margaret, Karen, Judith, Nora, a woman named Patricia who had moved to the street the previous spring after her divorce settlement finalized, and who was quieter than the others and took longer to arrive at things, but who turned out, when she did arrive, to have opinions about almost everything that were worth waiting for. She and I talked about woodworking for nearly 2 hours at one point, which nobody was more surprised by than Patricia herself, who had been learning dovetail joints from a YouTube channel and had stronger views on the subject than she had expected to develop. And a woman named Elaine, who was 62, had been divorced for 11 years, and who looked at me very directly about 20 minutes into our first coffee and said, "You know you're doing something unusual, don't you?" I told her I thought I was just having coffee. She smiled with the patience of someone who had been watching people misunderstand themselves for a very long time. "That's not all it is," she said. Her voice had no judgment in it, just observation, stated plainly. I couldn't tell whether it was a warning or a compliment, and I didn't ask, which was, in retrospect, one of the cleaner examples of me not asking the right question at the right time. I told myself it was a compliment. That was probably the first real mistake. Spring came, and with it the beginning of everything complicated. Not one large dramatic thing. Not a confrontation or a betrayal or a moment where the whole structure broke at once in a way that was at least satisfying in its clarity. It was quieter than that. It was the slow revelation that I had been doing something I didn't fully understand, and that several different people had been drawing several different conclusions about what that something meant, and that I had let all of those conclusions run parallel to each other without doing anything to bring them into a room and look at them honestly. The first sign came from Karen. We had become what I would call genuinely friendly by then. Coffee had extended into occasional walks on the trail behind the elementary school in the mornings. She didn't have to be at the hospital, and the walks had produced a comfortable shorthand between us. She knew I took my coffee black and that I went quiet when I was thinking about something I hadn't worked out yet. I knew she circled back to check the door lock twice before leaving the house, and that she had a habit of starting to tell a story and then abandoning it midway through when she decided it wasn't interesting enough to finish, which it always was, and I always told her so. Then she showed up at my door on a Saturday afternoon in April with a look I had not seen on her face before. Not angry, not hurt, more like she had been assembling a thought carefully for several days and had finally finished the assembly and needed to set it down somewhere. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said. I said yes. She looked past me into the house for a second, then back. "Are you in love with someone on this street?" "Istir daher." She held my gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who had stopped flinching at difficult questions because life had simply provided too many of them to keep flinching at. "Because the way you do this," she said, "it feels very intentional." And I need to know whether you're being kind to all of us or whether you're working towards something specific. Because if it's the second thing, and I'm not saying it is, but if it is, I think people deserve to know what room they're standing in. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel. She wasn't being cruel. She was being Karen, which meant she was being careful and direct and slightly ahead of everyone else in the room. Because it was so precise. Because it identified something I had been carefully not naming for months and put it on the table in the afternoon light where I had to look at it. I told her I wasn't working toward anything, that I had started all of this because Margaret needed someone to talk to, and I happened to be available, and it had grown from there in a way that felt natural and honest. Karen listened. She nodded at the right times. She looked at her hands once. Then she said, "Daniel, I believe you think that's true." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The implication had legs. She left and I sat in my kitchen with the woodworking project I had been moving around my workbench for 2 weeks without actually committing to, and I thought about what she had said, about the space between what I thought I was doing and what was actually happening in the rooms where I sat across from women who had been left alone with their lives and asked them to talk to me, about whether I had been generous or strategic, about whether those two things could be the same thing without me noticing. I didn't arrive at an answer that afternoon. I arrived at the uncomfortable recognition that there was a question I had been successfully not asking myself, and that Karen had just stood on my porch and asked it for me. The second sign came from Judith. She called me on a Wednesday night in May, which she had never done before. Always a texter, always brief and practical, even in the texts. Her voice was tight in the way voices get when someone has been holding themselves together all day and is finally letting themselves make sound about it. Her ex-husband was getting remarried. She had found out through her son, not directly, not in a call, not even in a text. Through a photograph her son had posted of the engagement party without thinking about what his mother would see when she opened the app on a regular Wednesday evening, expecting nothing in particular. She was fine. She said immediately. She was completely fine. She had made her peace with the divorce years ago. Actually made it, not just said she had made it. But apparently the remarriage was a different thing that lived in a different drawer entirely, and she had opened that drawer by accident with no warning and found out what was in it all at once. I stayed on the phone with her for an hour and 20 minutes. I spoke very little. I asked 2 questions, both of them small and practical in the way that gives a person something to hold while they're saying the harder things. When she finally ran out of words, she went quiet and then said, "I don't know why I called you." I thought about it briefly, then said, "You called me because I answer." She was quiet for another second. "That's exactly why," she said. And then she started crying again, harder this time, not because things had gotten worse, but because something she didn't know she needed had been named. And I sat on my end of the line and let her until it passed, which it did, the way things do when someone is finally allowed to feel them out loud. After we hung up, I sat for a long time with the phone on the table in front of me and understood something I had been successfully avoiding understanding for months. I had made myself into something for these women, not something false, not something built to manipulate or to perform kindness for some secondary purpose. Something real. But something that had its own weight and its own consequence and its own set of effects on people that I had not thought all the way through because I'd been too comfortable in the role to examine what the role was actually doing. I had become the man who showed up, the reliable one, the one who answered, the one who asked how you were doing and then stayed for the answer and asked the next question and the one after that. And the problem with being that man, the problem I had not seen coming, was that eventually you had to figure out what you were doing with everything that people gave you when they trusted you that much. Because trust accumulates. It changes the shape of things. And at some point, the shape of what I had built on Wentworth Lane had stopped being a casual Saturday habit and started being something I was responsible for in ways I had not signed up for explicitly. The thing that fell apart was not what I expected. It was not an explosion between 2 of the women, though I had developed a quiet anxiety about that for months. Every time I had coffee with one and knew I had coffee with others, I felt the particular unease of a person who has allowed a situation to get complex without naming the complexity, which means you have no way to manage it cleanly because you have never laid out what it is. It was not a confrontation from someone's ex-husband. It was not the gossip, though the gossip was real. Two women on the next street had apparently developed opinions that made their way back to me through the particular efficiency of neighborhood information exchange. One of them called it the Divorced Women's Coffee Club, which none of us had ever called it, but which I could not deny had some descriptive accuracy from the outside. What fell apart was me. Not loudly. I have heard stories where this kind of thing collapses with sound and spectacle and some revelation scene that at least has the dignity of being dramatic. This was not that kind of falling apart. It happened on a night in late April when I was sitting in my living room after dinner with nothing on and nothing to do, which used to be fine, which used to be what I wanted, which had once been the thing I was working toward every day. Just quiet. Just space. Just my house and my projects and my own company and the particular piece of not owing anyone anything. And I sat there in that quiet and realized I had not experienced it as peace in a long time. That I had not eaten a meal alone in 3 weeks without it feeling like something I was enduring rather than choosing. That the quietest parts of my days had started to feel like they were what I did while I was waiting for the real parts. That I was living toward the coffee conversations in a way that had become the organizing structure of my week without me ever deciding that was what I was doing. And then the room got dark while I forgot to turn on a light, which is the kind of specific thing that tells you something true about where your mind is gone. What I understood, sitting there in the dark in my own house, surrounded by evidence of my careful maintenance of a life I had built to be independent, was that I had started all of this because I was lonely, and I recognized loneliness in other people, and I'd found a way to address both things at once without having to name what I was doing or be honest about the need that was driving it. Every cup of coffee had been a genuine act of care. That was true. I was not lying to anyone. I was not using people. But underneath the care was a man who had been alone for 3 years and had found a way to not feel alone without having to be brave about it, without having to look at one person and say, clearly and directly, I am here. I would like to be known. I am tired of my own company, and I am asking something of you. I have been extending care as a way of receiving it without having to ask. And asking was the thing that frightened me, because asking meant the answer might be no, and no meant the loneliness was confirmed, which was apparently worse than just continuing to live inside it quietly. That was the thing that fell apart. Not a relationship, not a friendship. My comfortable story about what I was doing and what I needed and whether those two things were as separate as I had been pretending. I called Margaret the next morning. She answered on the second ring. I told her I needed to talk to her honestly about something. She said okay. The way she said it told me she had been half expecting this. The way she said it told me she was steadier than I was going to be. We met at the same cafe on Elmwood where we had started 6 months before. She was there when I arrived, same corner table, 2 coffees already ordered the way I took mine and the way she took hers, without having to ask. I sat down. She looked at me with the steady expression of someone who had been handed difficult truths before and was practiced at receiving them, without flinching and without making the delivery harder for the person doing it. I told her the truth, not the comfortable version. Not the version where I was purely generous and clear-eyed and motivated only by neighborly decency. The whole version. That I had started all of this because I recognized loneliness because I was living it. That somewhere in the course of all those mornings and all those conversations, I had started to feel things that were not part of the original understanding. Not for all of them. Not as a category. Not as some vague warmth toward women who were kind to me. For her specifically, in a way, I had been going around the edges of without looking at directly, because looking at it directly required me to be honest about what I needed, which was the thing I was worst at. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting me once. She held her coffee with both hands and looked at my face and let me talk, and the only indication she gave that anything I said was landing anywhere was a small, careful movement at the corner of her mouth near the end that might have been the beginning of something or might have been nothing at all. When I finished, the cafe went on around us. Someone at the counter ordered something complicated with several modifications. A child at the back table knocked over a sugar dispenser and laughed at the noise. The ordinary sound of a place full of people who weren't having the conversation I was having and didn't know one was being had. She looked at her coffee for a while, then at the window, then at me. Daniel, she said, do you know what I thought the first time you asked me to coffee? I said I didn't. She smiled slightly. I thought, this is a man who has figured out a very careful way to be around people without having to risk anything himself. I thought, that's clever and a little sad. I nodded. She continued, then I thought you were just a kind person and I was overthinking it because I had become accustomed to looking for the catch. She picked up her coffee. And now you're sitting here telling me it was both. I said yes. I think it was both. She held my gaze for a long second, and the cafe noise kept happening around us, and I had no idea what was coming next, which was itself information, because after 6 months of these mornings, I had started to think I could predict where Margaret Holloway was going in a conversation, and apparently, I had been wrong about that too. She said, I'm not angry. I want you to know that first. Then she said, what you gave to everyone on this street was real. That doesn't stop being real because you also needed it. The same thing can be two true things at once. I sat with that. Then she said, but I think you already know that the way you've been doing this has to change. Not stopped. Changed. There's a difference. She wasn't accusing me. She was just telling me the truth in the way she told everything, which was as gently as possible and without softening it past the point where it could still do its job. She was right. I knew it the way you know something you've been successfully walking around the edges of for too long. The careful structure I had built, the Saturday mornings, the open invitations, the way I had made myself available to everyone and specific to no one, because being specific to someone meant something you couldn't easily take back. That structure was a way of being close without being accountable for the closeness. Honest in its parts, not honest about the whole. I stopped organizing the coffees after that. Not abruptly, not with an announcement, just let them exist where they naturally existed instead of engineering them into something with its own careful logic. Karen and I still walk the trail sometimes. Judith still called occasionally. Patricia and I had a real conversation about wood joinery that led to her coming by the garage one Saturday afternoon and showing me a technique for blind dovetails I had been doing wrong for 2 years, which she delivered with the same direct precision she brought to everything, which I appreciated more than I said. Elaine stayed exactly as she had always been. Watchful, warm, in no hurry whatsoever. She came by in June with a pot of soup she said she had made too much of, which was clearly untrue, but which I accepted with no comment. She sat on the front porch for an hour and talked about her garden and then went home. As she was leaving, she said, "You figured it out." I asked what I had figured out. She looked at me the same way she had the first time in the cafe. Then she smiled and walked down the porch steps and didn't answer. Nora Tillman knocked on my door one evening in June with a direct look on her face and a sentence already loaded. She said, "I hear you've been reassessing things." I told her that was one way to describe it. She said, "For what it's worth, I always thought the coffees were as much for you as for us." I asked how she had known. She smiled like the question was slightly too easy. "Because the people who only want to help don't show up that consistently," she said. "People show up consistently when they need something too." She handed me back the jar the marmalade had come in and told me she needed it for the next batch. Then she went home, very Nora about all of it. I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward, about the difference between being needed and needing, about how long I had been confusing one for a substitute for the other. Margaret and I had coffee again in July. Not organized, not at the same cafe necessarily. More like the conversation from the spring had opened something that hadn't closed again, and we were both moving around in the opening and figuring out what we were doing there. She brought her younger daughter once, who evaluated me with the frank, unguarded assessment of a 14-year-old that involves looking at someone for exactly as long as she needs and then going back to her phone. Margaret apologized. I told her not to. She didn't. By September, we had stopped calling it coffee and started calling it Saturday, the way people do when a thing has enough history behind it that it doesn't need a label to hold its shape. She knew that I got restless if I stayed inside all afternoon, and I knew she got quiet in a specific way when something was bothering her that was different from a regular quiet. And neither of us had announced that we knew these things, we just knew them the way you know the layout of a room you've spent enough time in. I'm not going to tell you this became simple. It didn't. Simple is what you get in stories where the complicated part has been edited out to make the ending feel neat. What I got was real, which meant it had texture and difficulty, and evenings where the distance between two people who were both practiced at protecting themselves felt almost too wide to cross. Mornings where one of us said something careful instead of true, and both of us knew it, and neither said so. The particular difficulty of trusting something you've been burned by before, which is different from the difficulty of anything else because it requires you to do the thing while knowing exactly what it costs if it goes wrong again. But Margaret had already told me the thing I needed to hear, about the difference between showing up carefully and showing up honestly, about the gap between offering something and actually risking something. And I had heard her. What I learned on that street full of women who had also been handed a life different from the one they had planned was something I should have probably learned earlier and might have saved myself 3 years of very careful loneliness. You cannot fix the loneliness with usefulness. You can be the most reliable person in a 4-block radius. You can fix shutters and answer phones and sit across from people in coffee shops and listen to everything they need to say. And at the end of every one of those mornings, you can drive home and walk into the same house with the same chair in the second bedroom and the same kitchen painted a color you chose by elimination. Because reliability is not the same thing as presence. Showing up is not the same thing as arriving. At some point, you have to stop organizing the distance and just stand in it. Without the structure, without the frame you built to make the need feel like generosity, without the story you've been telling yourself about why you are where you are and what you're doing there. That is harder than being useful. It is harder than being reliable. It is harder than fixing a corroded latch on a Saturday morning and handing someone back the thing they couldn't manage alone. But it is the only version that counts in the end. The only version that builds something instead of just managing the space around the absence of something. On a Saturday morning in late October, almost exactly 1 year after I had knocked on Margaret Holloway's door and spent 5 minutes with a screwdriver and then said, without planning to, if you ever want coffee, I was sitting on my front porch with a mug in my hand watching the street do its normal morning things. A dog being walked, a kid on a bike, the particular amber light that happens in October on that block because of the way the trees on the east side catch it. Margaret came down the sidewalk from the direction of her house. No arrangement, no organized event, just her moving in this direction because it was Saturday and that was where she was going. She sat down in the other chair without asking because it had become the kind of thing that didn't require asking. She reached over without looking at me and straightened the angle of my mug on the armrest so it wouldn't slide. Small thing. Done without thinking. Done because she had noticed it was at risk of tipping and she noticed things. I looked at her. She was watching the street with the attention she brought to most things, taking in the whole picture before deciding what she thought about it. I had spent the last year learning the difference between a woman managing alone and a woman who had chosen her own terms. Between someone enduring the quiet and someone who had decided the quiet was also allowed to contain good things. I had spent the last year learning the same things about myself, more slowly and with more resistance, but learning them. The street was quiet. Down the block, a lawnmower started and stopped. 2 kids on bikes went past without looking at us. Normal Saturday, noise on a normal street where 12 families live their ordinary lives next to each other and mostly didn't know the half of what those lives contained. Margaret said, "Eventually, you have a bad habit of thinking too loudly." I said, "You can't possibly hear that." She turned and looked at me with the exact expression she used when something I said was technically accurate and entirely missing what she meant. I laughed once, the real kind, not the polite version. She smiled, not the careful one from the beginning, the one she had stopped hiding sometime around July when we both stopped pretending ease and started actually feeling it. I looked out at Wentworth Lane, my house, her house 4 doors down, the distance I had managed and mismanaged and finally stopped treating as a thing to be managed and just let exist. The particular October light on the rose bushes that were, I had been informed, doing better this year than the last several. I thought about Karen's question, whether I was being kind to all of them or working towards something specific. The answer I couldn't give her then was that both things had been true, and neither of them was the whole story. The whole story was a man who had lost something quiet and important and had found an honest way back toward it by sitting down with people who understood the cost of losing things and knew that you could choose to keep going anyway. Who had learned, by watching the women around him manage and grieve and rebuild and laugh and keep going, that the thing he had been calling peace was actually just avoidance wearing patience's clothes. The whole story was a porch in October. 2 chairs. 1 mug at a safer angle on an armrest. The particular kind of silence that isn't empty, that is full of things that don't need to be said because they're already understood. I did not fix everything. I want to be clear about that too, because the story where everything gets fixed is the dishonest version, and I have been trying, since April of the previous year, to stop telling dishonest versions, even the ones that are easier. There were things I broke by being halfway honest for too long. Assumptions people had made about what I was offering that I had allowed to form, because naming them would have required naming other things I wasn't ready for yet. A conversation with Judith that got briefly difficult before it found its way back to something true. A neighbor 2 streets over who still looked at me with an expression I had decided, for the sake of my own peace, to stop interpreting. What I can say is this. Every cup of coffee on that street was a real thing. Every conversation meant what it seemed to mean. The care was not performance. The care was real. But the frame around the care was something I had built to protect myself from the specific vulnerability of needing something you aren't sure you deserve. And when I finally stopped protecting myself so carefully, the whole thing got truer. Not easier. Towa. And in the long run, truer is what holds. That is not a comfortable story. Comfortable stories have a clean line from problem to solution, and the solution looks exactly like what you imagined it would look like before the problem started. This is an honest one instead. The solution looked like a porch chair and a mug at a corrected angle, and a woman who remembered how I took my coffee without using the fact of remembering to prove anything. Which is, as it turns out, what I've been looking for the whole time without knowing how to say so. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had a moment where what you thought you were doing and what you were actually doing turn out to be 2 different things, and what it felt like when the distance between them got too small to keep ignoring. And have you ever found something you needed in a place you weren't expecting to look? If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.